Joining us more to speak about Mattis's visit to Ukraine, John Sitilides, global risk analyst at Trilogy Advisors. John, there's supposed to be a ceasefire that's going into effect tomorrow in eastern Ukraine. Any hopes that that will lead to a long-term solution?
I doubt that any ceasefire right now would lead to a long-term solution. That really depends on what Vladimir Putin's longer-term objectives are, not only in eastern Ukraine, but especially in Crimea. And recall the rhetoric that's come out of Moscow in recent years about how Russia was founded in the Ukraine, that Ukraine, in a sense, belongs to Russia, if not directly in its sphere of influence. And it's going to take many, many tools in our diplomatic toolkit to be able to get Russia to adhere to the Minsk agreement. That's really the short-term objective of a ceasefire, and eventually to release Crimea back to an independent Ukraine over the long term.
The matter is under review at the Pentagon and State Department, or at least in the administration. But do you think it's a good idea for the United States to send weapons to Ukraine?
I think what it's really going to come down to is, to what extent does the United States look to help Ukraine make this a more painful occupation or operation on Putin's part in Ukraine? If we send lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine, what you're going to be seeing is anti-tank weaponry taking out Putin's tanks and limiting his ability to fire rockets and artillery at Ukrainian forces, But more importantly, it'll increase the possibility of Russian deaths and casualties and make this a potentially more unpopular war in Russia and weaken Putin's hold on power. So the question is going to be, A, to what extent do we think that's going to bring Putin to the table to discuss Minsk and to potentially discuss Crimea? But none of this is happening in isolation, because we do need Russia's help in trying to make sure that Iran does not establish long-term basing and highways in Syria to connect Iran, Iraq to Lebanon. We want to make sure that we are very careful about what's going to be happening with the military exercises in several weeks. About 20 to 100,000 Russian troops, the largest exercise in 25 years, near Poland and Lithuania in the Baltics. And of course, Russia continues to be very influential through occupation forces in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Moldova. And so there's a whole array of security issues we need to be mindful of with whatever strategy we adopt next in Ukraine.
Let's take a step back for a second. Sending these weapons to Ukraine, Trump has said he likes Putin. He said it several times. So sending these weapons, is Trump having a change of heart, or is it coming from his generals?
Oh, no, I think, to be fair to President Trump, look, he met with Mr. Poroshenko before he met with Vladimir Putin earlier this year. He's maintained and actually stepped up the sanctions on Ukraine. Having Secretary Mattis, the sanctions on Russia, pardon me, having Secretary Mattis visit Ukraine and having Secretary Tillerson both talk about the importance of independence for Ukraine today as it celebrates its Independence Day. And remember, the United States was the arsenal of democracy during the Cold War, helping to shore up politically and through military weaponry those countries that fought against communism directly or oppression more generally. So I think there have been a number of very important pro-Ukraine steps taken by the Trump administration, but providing lethal anti-tank weaponry to Ukraine to put a real bloody cost on this war for Putin is going to be potentially a threshold decision for President Trump.
You mentioned the Russian exercises that are coming soon, the idea that there'll be tens of thousands, if not 100,000 troops, essentially on the border with Lithuania and Poland, and also the northern part of Ukraine. They will also have tanks. There's some people in the region who feel that this is a Trojan horse, that Putin might use these forces to actually invade. What's your view?
Well, it's difficult to imagine Putin invading Lithuania because, of course, that would trigger a NATO-wide response, including a U.S. response. So I don't see anything quite so blatant, nor in Poland, obviously, a much larger country than Lithuania. But the question is going to be, can he take the kinds of very subtle steps, the way he did with the initial invasion of Ukraine, with non-uniformed, quote-unquote, little green men that couldn't be identified or directly tied to the Russian army, to engage in subterfuge, to engage in political subversion in Lithuania, in Poland, in a non-violent manner, but that might trigger or require some type of a hostile or violent response from NATO, and in effect make NATO the first attacker, the offender in this type of a situation. situation? And if NATO doesn't respond in kind, do we lose the confidence of Baltic countries and of Poland in the United States backing up those countries against a Russian threat?
Right.
So Putin is to be guarded very, very carefully against. We don't know what might be happening with these exercises, but it's why he's been so skillful on the geopolitical chessboard the last several years.
John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.